with the coronavirus pandemic. Some say we need to vote by mail. President Trump disagrees bigly. Welcome back to America Uncovered. I'm Chris Chappell. The November election is fast approaching. Actually, no, it's been a slow and grinding slog. Remember when there were 28 candidates on the Democratic ticket? And how we were like, things could not get any more ridiculous. And then 2020 came, and everything got more ridiculous. The good news is we're less than 80 days away from the election. And the bad news is, we're less than 80 days away from the election. And the latest wrench thrown into these electoral gears is the controversy over mail-in ballots. President Trump is not a fan.
It's going to be a catastrophe.
Which, up until last week, was ridiculous. As if there could be vote-by-mail fraud. The Brookings Institute said there is no evidence that mail ballots increase electoral fraud. So how dare Trump try to stop mail-in voting? But that was before. By the middle of last week, the story seems to have shifted. Now you see, President Trump wants mail-in voting, so he can sabotage it. I mean, he still definitely doesn't want mail-in voting, which is why he's sabotaging it. But he can't sabotage it if there's no mail-in voting. So he wants mail-in voting so he can sabotage it. And are you confused? I'm confused. I get confused a lot on this show. Partly, that's because media narratives shift constantly. And partly because a lot of media don't actually give you enough context. The context is, with the coronavirus pandemic, some people say that voting in person is risking your life. Wait, is going to the polls more dangerous than going to the grocery store? Hard to say. At least polling stations can enforce better social distancing. But still, for some people, the risk is too high. And for that reason, there is a big push to greatly expand mail-in voting for the 2020 election, even to people who are not at high risk of getting the coronavirus. However, what makes this more complicated is that there's not a single type of mail-in voting. It's different for each state. A lot of states have absentee voting, which is one type of mail-in voting. Absentee voting is where you, the registered voter, have to request a ballot and then mail it in by a certain deadline. It's for people who can't be in their district on election day. A lot of people in the military use absentee ballots, and so do people who travel a lot or can't leave home because of illness. In fact, President Trump says he'll be voting by absentee ballot. Trump has repeatedly said he's fine with absentee ballots, but he opposes what he calls universal mail-in ballots. Here's Vice President Pence explaining the difference.
Absentee balloting is perfectly acceptable. You have to apply for an absentee ballot, signatures are checked, it's confirmed, it has a long tradition, and we want to encourage any American that is not able to go to the polling place for any reason to apply for an absentee ballot today. But this universal mail-in voting where you're going to see literally ballots showered all across the state, it is ripe for fraud.
I'm not saying he's right about the difference, but it's important to know what Trump and Pence are referring to when they say mail-in voting versus absentee ballots. Now, in response to the coronavirus pandemic, many states have already made it easier to get an absentee ballot or to vote by mail. According to the Washington Post, 77% of America will be eligible to vote by mail in this year's presidential election. That's 180 million Americans. Now, for many years, these 5 states have had a system that encourages everyone to vote by mail. These states send out mail-in ballots to all registered voters for each election. This is universal mail-in voting, at least for these states. This year, 5 more states plus DC have said they will do that. An additional 10 states won't send the ballots automatically, but plan to send everyone an application to get a mail-in ballot. 7 states allow you to request an absentee ballot, but you have to provide a reason, beyond just a fear of the coronavirus. And in the other 23 states, you can request a no-excuse absentee ballot, meaning you don't have to provide a reason, but you still have to actively make that request. In other words, the mail-in voting system is already complicated, and it's about to get way more complicated. The 5 states I mentioned that have been doing mail-in ballots for many years only represent 7% of the U.S. population. To expand that system to the rest of the country this year requires a massive scale-up, and only a few months to do it. Now, Democrats and Republicans have different concerns with mail-in voting. Democrats are afraid that Republicans are trying to stop mail-in voting to suppress voter turnout and steal the election, while Republicans are afraid that Democrats are trying to commit voter fraud and steal the election. If this sounds familiar, it's because it's basically the same argument both sides have been having for years over other issues like voter ID laws. Let's talk about mail-in voting fraud. Mail-in voting fraud does happen. Absentee ballot applications have been sent to dead people and dogs, and at least one cat. I think we all know that the cat would have voted for himself. Non-citizens have also been registered to vote, but usually not on purpose. According to a national investigation, absentee ballot fraud makes up 24.2% of all reported prosecutions of election crimes between 2000 and 2012. That makes it the most prevalent type of election fraud. But there have only been 491 confirmed cases in a period of 12 years. Out of more than 1 billion votes cast, that's a tiny, tiny fraction. So fraud is not the main concern with expanding mail-in voting. The main concerns are, can the U.S. Postal Service handle it, and can states that have historically not handled this much mail-in voting be ready to do that by November 3rd? Sure, a few states have already been doing it for years, but to scale it up for the other 45 states is a huge task. Some states anticipate 10 times the normal volume of election mail. And already, the U.S. Postal Service hasn't been doing so well. According to an audit by the Government Accountability Office in May, it's not financially sustainable, largely because of the way it's staffed and operated. One member of the House Oversight Committee said the Postal Service's business model is failing, and simply throwing more of taxpayers' hard-earned money at them won't fix their problems. But I mean, it's the post office. You know, neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. USPS released a statement saying it has ample capacity to handle any additional volume caused by the coronavirus. Except, USPS also alerted 46 states that it cannot ensure ballots sent by mail in the general election will arrive in time to be counted. So you can send in your vote by mail, but it might not arrive in time to be counted. You might as well not bother to vote. So there are 46 states where votes by mail might not arrive in time to be counted. And these include some of the battleground states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Florida. Good old Florida. Pennsylvania is asking the Supreme Court to allow mail ballots received up to 3 days after the November 3rd election to be counted, with proof that they were mailed before that date. I mean, that's what they did in New York for the June primary election. The Washington Post described that election as a train wreck. At the center of this mess is a massive influx of mail-in ballots and a system wholly unprepared to process them. It's not just delayed results that are at issue. Tens of thousands of mail-in ballots were invalidated for technicalities, like a missing signature or a missing postmark on the envelope. It took 6 weeks to figure out who won. Imagine waiting 6 more weeks to figure out who won the presidential election. And you thought 2020 couldn't get any worse. To be fair to the post office, that was an example of New York State not being able to handle the mail-in ballots as well. I'm sure when you add in dozens of other states, everything will be fine. Look, when it comes to in-person voting at polling stations, America has had more than 200 years to figure out how to handle that. But now, we have less than 3 months to figure out how to handle 100 million additional ballots by mail, all of which need to be processed by a very specific deadline.
If you do universal mail-ins with millions and millions of ballots, you're never going to know what the real result of an election is.
But don't worry, Congress has a creative solution. Throw money at it. The Postal Service requested $25 billion in additional funding, and the Democratic-led House of Representatives wants to give it to them as part of the next coronavirus stimulus bill. I mean, the U.S. Postal Service is a failing and mismanaged government bureaucracy, which is why if you give them billions of more dollars, they're sure to manage everything well from now on. But somehow, Trump doesn't think so. He talked about not wanting to give the USPS more money for universal mail-in voting as one of the reasons the new stimulus bill is stalled.
This is all over.
So this is what's holding it up. They want...
No,
So,
that's
Mr.
only one
President,
aspect
this is what's
of it.
holding up money for the American people. They want mail-in votings and they want money for the post office. This is one of the sticking points that's holding back stimulus for Americans during this coronavirus.
Oh,
the
yeah, that's
Democrats
one of
wanting
them.
money for the post office for mail-in voting.
That's one of them. That's right. How
What
would you
else,
like
Mr.
to have,
President?
Maria, how would you like to have $3.5 billion for mail-in voting? Billion. So if you didn't have it, you wouldn't. You know how much money that is? Nobody has any idea. You know, people, $3.5 billion. They want $25 billion for the post office because the post office is going to have to go to town to get these ridiculous ballots in. You know, there's nothing wrong with getting out and voting. Two of the items are the post office and the $3.5 billion for mail-in voting. Now, if we don't make a deal, that means they don't get the money. That means they can't have universal mail-in voting. They just can't have it. So, you know, sort of a crazy thing.
How many states will be doing?
Those are two of the items, but there are many more items.
Legislature.
Of course, that caused a huge backlash.
Former President Barack Obama said on Friday that he is worried about protecting the integrity of November's election in view of efforts by President Donald Trump to, quote, kneecap the U.S. Postal Service to limit Americans voting by mail.
And conspiracy theories are swirling over the U.S. Postmaster General Louis DeJoy. He's a Trump supporter. He was only appointed in May this year. Now, despite the audit I mentioned that reveals the Postal Service has had major problems for a long time, all of the current problems are being blamed on the new Postmaster General.
Tonight, a backlog of undelivered mail is piling up in post offices around the country. Now, with widespread use of mail-in ballots expected in November because of the coronavirus, workers are blaming the new Postmaster General, a top Republican campaign donor who has given more than $1.1 million to the Trump Victory Fund.
And this has led some to suspect the Postmaster General is working with Trump to actively sabotage mail-in voting. President Trump is delaying the mail so he can rig the November election. No, that's not Alex Jones. That's the New York Times. 2020, the year that just keeps getting worse. Now, some Democrats are urging the FBI to open an investigation into the Postmaster General. Is it possible Trump is working with his supporter in the Postal Service to make sure it stays broken? Sure, it's possible. But the sudden focus on the Postal Service has also led to some conspiracy theory level panic about things like mailboxes being moved, which the Postal Service has promised to stop doing, even though they say it was just part of normal procedures. Imagine being the Postal Service spokesperson who has to explain that they removed the mailboxes because people weren't using them, while U.S. senators are writing to the Postmaster General demanding that all the mailboxes be put back. I can see where those $25 billion are going to go. They're going to spend it all on more mailboxes. So the problems at the Postal Service probably can't be fixed in time for the November election, regardless of who's in charge. Unless it was Moist von Lipwig. I mean, there's a whole book about how he can make the Postal Service more efficient. What's that, Shelley? That book is fiction? I knew there was something off about Discworld. Anyway, the Washington Post says the problems at the U.S. Postal Service have been around for a long time. The problems predate the cost-cutting measures. A late return ballot was the chief reason absentee or mail ballots were disqualified during the 2016 election. The surge in mail-in voting so far this year during the primary elections has already been a huge problem. Here's the Washington Post again. The onslaught of vote-by-mail ballots, driven by directives to stay at home and practice social distancing during the pandemic, has increased the volume of delays this year. In D.C.'s early June primary, election officials drove around town hand-delivering ballots because the mail service was not quick enough. In Florida, 18,500 mailed ballots arrived too late to be counted during the March primary. Tens of thousands of late ballots in Pennsylvania were counted only after courts intervened. Meanwhile, Nevada had the opposite problem, with more than 200,000 returned undelivered ballots in one county. For all of you old enough to remember the 2000 election between George W. Bush and Al Gore, imagine that happening, but with the entire country instead of just Florida.
The one thing no one expected in a presidential campaign is that we wouldn't know who won on Election Day.
CNN announces that we call Florida in the Al Gore column.
Stand by. CNN right now is moving our earlier declaration of Florida back to the too close to call column. George Bush, governor of Texas, will become the 43rd president of the United States.
But this race is simply too close to call.
And folks, in the year 2004, please, could you make up your minds a little more conclusively? Because I think we can't take another election like this one.
Oh, if only. Because my prediction is, come Election Day this year, unless there is a landslide victory, we will have no idea if Biden or Trump won. And I do not predict a landslide victory for either candidate. Both sides will be arguing endlessly about mail-in ballots, demanding recounts, and by the end of 2020, we will still have no conclusive victory to the U.S. presidential election. It's like 2020 has set a trap for us, and we're walking right into it. What are we doing, people? And if, like in the 2000 election, it's left to the Supreme Court to decide, just remember, Trump has picked 2 Supreme Court judges. And let's just say, Ruth Bader Ginsburg isn't doing so well. So whether you agree with Trump that mail-in ballots are a bad idea, or you think Trump is trying to sabotage the mail-in ballot system, everyone should agree the safest thing is for as many people as possible to register to vote, educate yourself about your state's voting laws, and vote in person. Thanks for watching. This episode is made possible through the support of viewers, people like you who contribute $1 or more per episode. Go to patreon.com/AmericaUncovered to learn how you can support us. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. Thanks for watching America Uncovered.